I'm Nick Bray from NBA. NBA is an architecture studio based in Vancouver and Victoria. I'm speaking to you today from Vancouver on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you attended the previous two seminars, thank you for supporting us again. As a result of the positive feedback we have received, we have plans for a number of seminars next year, including teaming up with CarbonWise to discuss zero carbon step code, touching on cooling requirements and heat pumps, and also further wisdom from Celerity Engineering regarding fire protection and life safety systems, including the subject of fire stopping. That seems to instill fear in all architects. So later this week, we will email everyone a link to a recording of this seminar and also links to the previous two seminars. The first of which was a general review of all the revisions to the 2024 BC Building Code provided by Celerity Engineering. And the second seminar was with both Celerity and Timber Engineering. It was more specifically about the adaptable dwelling and seismic requirements that are coming into effect in March 2025. Today, Corie is going to provide us with an update to those adaptability requirements. Since the last seminar, organisations like the CHBA have been working with the Building and Safety Standards branch to give clarity on the many ambiguities in the new code. In our office, these clarifications have made a significant difference to the design of our adaptable apartment layouts. The most impactful for us was the required size of the main bed, as Corie will discuss. We've also been involved in providing feedback on the relating in-stream project exemption criteria. To be honest, this could have been a very simple definition for in-stream, but it's become a bit of a mess, causing confusion and different interpretations in different municipalities. We'll discuss that more later. Before our presentation on adaptable dwellings, we're going to focus on the new single exit stair allowances. This is a new, exciting residential type, and our office has just started working on one of these now. So, as always, I'm looking forward to hearing Marc's insight on this subject. If you have any questions during these presentations, please enter them in the chat box, and we'll try and get to them after each of the two presentations. But please try and keep those questions short. In the same chat box, we'll be providing a link at which you can apply for your AIBC learning credits. You just click on the link and it's a very quick form you have to fill out. We've been working with Celerity Engineering now for many, many years, and they're very much a very important part of our integrated team. Let's get started with Brian Fraser, Principal of Celerity Engineering. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be able to join you again on these it's turning out to be very successful presentations. It's very exciting for us to be able to disseminate our knowledge and help the architects out there. So Celerity Engineering is a full code and fire life safety engineering firm. We support architects throughout their designs, many different building types, from smaller single family homes, so rarely we do work on those, up to much larger multifamily and institutional buildings, industrial buildings, and so forth. And today we're excited to present on these items, a new single exit stair, and then an update on the adaptable dwelling. Look forward, and I hope this is helpful for everyone as well. All right, back to you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So let's get started. Please let me introduce Marc Showers, who is registered as a professional engineer and certified professional. He's been practicing building codes, consulting with Celerity Engineering since 2015. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. Excited to talk about this new topic, new allowance in the code. So this is the single exit stair buildings revisions to the British Columbia Building Code 2024 edition. This is specifically revision 3 that we're discussing today. Nick already went over my bio a little bit. So I've been with Celerity since 2015. It's been a pleasure working and growing with Celerity over the past 9 years. I've definitely learned a lot, and there's always changes to the code, so always more to explore, it seems. As Brian mentioned, this is a little bit about what we do: certified professional projects, alternative solutions, code reviews, anything really related to building code, and a few additional things here and there. If you're interested in what we do, happy to talk about it. So a bit about what we're planning to talk about today. So my objective for this is to help you understand and apply the SES, or Single Exit Stair, requirements in the BC Building Code. We're going to cover these changes in revision 3 to the code, which were effective August 27th of this year. So they are already in force, and you can design and apply for a building permit today, and no issues with that. So there's no waiting period for this one. One thing to note is you won't find these revisions in the full copy of the code yet. It hasn't been published, so there's a separate PDF that you have to access with those changes. And you can find that on the BC government website, where you find revisions to the code. There'll be a link to that one under revision 3. So when we're talking about single exit stair buildings, these revisions, we're really talking about something that's sometimes referred to as point access block style buildings. So I've drawn a very crude code consultant sketch here of what this could look like. There's other configurations, of course, but generally it'll be one stair, an elevator, and a corridor serving a number of units on a single floor level. And then we'll kind of get into the height and size restrictions of all this, but that's kind of the general idea. We're not talking about townhouse buildings or anything of that nature. In terms of outline, we're going to discuss motivations and pushbacks, kind of why this is coming up now, what we're hearing in terms of pushbacks against these requirements in the industry, go over the application of these new requirements, kind of the mechanism in the code for how to make this work. And then we'll talk about the key principles, what you need to know before designing. This includes the sort of where can you build these. It's mostly related to firefighting assumptions. What do these buildings look like? And all of these specific construction requirements, which I'm calling the how, the nitty-gritty stuff. So why is this coming about? The primary motivation for this is related to housing supply. So it was a BC government-led initiative. They worked with private industry to sort of study how this could be done in a code revision, and that went through, I think, several peer review processes and was implemented. So it didn't go through the normal sort of national level code review. That hasn't happened. I believe probably the main reason for that is that's a fairly slow process. You know, there's a new code that comes out every 4 or 5 years. If they wanted to get into that code cycle, they certainly could have, but we wouldn't have seen anything in BC for probably, I'm guessing, at least 8 years. So they wanted something faster than that, so they've gone through a different process in this case. Another motivation is density on smaller lots. With the 2 exit stair design, it can be quite challenging to get your 2 stairs on smaller lots, so you end up with land assembly and higher costs due to that. You can do scissor stairs and things, but it gets a little bit tricky. So this is sort of to help with building density on smaller lots and also allow different building and unit configurations. I think the architects out there can probably speak to this more than I can, but if you have a smaller footprint with only 1 stair, you can have more units on the corners or sort of digging up more of a full floor plate, so you get more windows, or units facing more sides, or more sunlight, that kind of thing. In terms of pushback, the main thing that I have seen is the BC Professional Firefighters Association and Fire Chiefs Association released a joint statement in opposition of the new revisions. From reading their statement, the main two items that I took away from that is they were opposed to the fact that the province didn't follow the national code development process for that, and also that they are seeing low levels of compliance with the fire code in apartment buildings. So they have concerns about how these new revisions will put additional stress on or add additional risks, I guess, due to compliance issues. And the last thing I noted here is sort of my own question. It's not related to the fire services, but the Building Code Appeal Board is BCAB there. And I guess I'm curious to see if we will see appeals from municipalities who do not want to allow these buildings. So that's just a question I have moving forward. It'd be interesting to see kind of how things shake out. So in terms of applying the new requirements, how do they work? They've added a new subsection into the code, subsection 3210. And it's important to note that any time you're designing a single exit stair building, it'll be considered a Part 3 building, regardless of size. So regardless of height or area, it'll still be Part 3. And also, these new revisions don't change any existing requirements. They really just add a new pathway for single exit stair design. There's currently already in the code an allowance for 1 or 2-story buildings with single exits, so none of those requirements have changed. If you're designing it under the old requirements in 3.4 of the code, then none of that's changed. You don't need to really consider these new revisions. Those technically wouldn't be considered single exit stair buildings, although they do have a single stair. And lastly, in a lot of the additional information provided with the revisions, it notes that these were developed for new construction only. So I think it's possible to apply these for an existing building, but you would really have to review it on a case-by-case basis and see if it was appropriate or not, if the assumptions that are that were used in developing these are applicable. So next up, we're going to get into where. So where are these buildings, or where can these buildings be built? And as I mentioned, this relates mostly to the firefighting assumptions and requirements that were a part of developing these allowances. So there's sort of two different aspects to the firefighting assumptions. There's the fire prevention portion and then the fire suppression portion. So fire prevention relates to anything that happens before a fire occurs. So you're trying to limit the probability that anything will happen. So the assumption in writing these was that a high level of fire prevention activities would be taking place. Essentially, that the local fire department would routinely enforce the BC Fire Code. Inspection intervals specified in the fire code are carried out, and that follow-up inspections resulting from non-compliances occur at expedited intervals. It doesn't really quantify that as far as I recall. Kind of keep that in mind here for a minute. And then the other aspect of this is the high level of response and fire suppression activities by firefighting personnel. So this really means a paid fire department that's available every day of the year, and they're highly trained and equipped. So they have search and rescue equipped personnel and the training that goes along with that. So they're able to go into the building and perform rescue operations if required. Now, with those two items, from what I've read in the code and in the notes that they provided, it's difficult to quantify these things. They provide lots of discussion around it, but I'm interested to see how this sort of shakes out if a municipality does not want to allow these things in their jurisdiction, if that's where we might see building code appeals or disputes, if a certain fire department feels like they're not equipped or trained to respond to a building like this, how that's going to be dealt with. I think in most, major urban centers, it's pretty obvious that most fire departments in major urban centers are fairly well equipped, but as you sort of get to outlying communities, it might be a little bit more up for debate. Lastly here, adequate water supply for firefighting is required. So this, again, probably isn't an issue in most urban centers, but the way the code works is Part 3 buildings, it mentions they need an adequate water supply. For other types of Part 3 buildings, if you have a sprinkler system in the building, that's considered to be adequate, and you don't need to really consider anything further. But for these types of buildings, even if you have a sprinkler system, you still need to consider additional water supply for manual firefighting operations. There's no specific standard referenced in the body of the code, but there are a few in the notes to the code. So it kind of depends on the specific jurisdiction that you're in as to how that gets considered. Okay, so that's a lot of background information. I guess one additional thing I should mention, sorry, before we move on, is where you can do this. So when the encapsulated mass timber requirements were brought into force, there were specific jurisdictions that opted in to using those or allowing them in their jurisdiction. These requirements are not like that. It just broadly applies everywhere. There's no like specific jurisdiction opt-in. It's really just, do they meet the criteria for the firefighting assumptions? That's kind of what it all comes down to. That there's no like opt-in type of situation like the encapsulated mass timber had. Okay, so what do these buildings look like? This is kind of where probably most of the interest will be, I think. Kind of help you figure out what you can do with these new requirements. So the most significant thing is that these are only for residential buildings and only specific types of residential buildings, which is general market housing. You're not allowed to use it for hotels, motels, dorms, senior residences, and other types of specialized residential occupancies. So general market housing only is kind of all that has been considered when coming up with these new requirements. One thing that I've noted as I've gone through these and looked at a few projects is there's no commentary on subsidiary uses like parking or storage, I suppose. It doesn't really address that at all. It doesn't say if it's allowed or if, for example, if you do have underground parking, are you allowed to have only one exit from there? Can you have two? I'm not completely sure about that, to be honest. It doesn't seem clear to me. So I think that's a topic maybe for future research, for an update at some point. In terms of building height, you're allowed to go up to 6 stories with these allowances and 18-meter height restriction, which is the same as the 6-story combustible construction article. And there's still exceptions for height limit for like rooftop enclosures for service spaces and elevators, for example. There are some additional things we'll get into once you're over 4 stories in terms of smoke movement, smoke control. But in general, you can go up to 6 stories with the single exit. Occupant load maximums, the code limits you to 4 dwelling units per floor and not more than 24 persons per floor. So essentially, this means 12 bedrooms per floor. In practice, that might look like 4 3-bedroom units. You usually don't see in apartments anything over 3 bedrooms, but you could have over 3 bedrooms in a unit as long as you're not exceeding the 24 person per floor. The 12 bedrooms per floor is just based on the 2 persons per bedroom that's typically applied for occupant load in the code. Okay, now into the what we have, continuing with what. Travel distance is another significant thing that will effectively limit the area of these buildings. So although you're allowed to, based on the 32251 construction article, you're allowed up to a certain area limit. I think that the travel distance limits in here will effectively reduce that. You won't really feasibly be able to go close to that limit, I don't think. So we have 25 meters to an exit from the furthest location. So you just have to look at every location in your floor, whatever the furthest is, has to be a max of 25 meters to the exit door. And note that's actually all the way to the exit. It's not to the suite door. So there's no allowance for measuring it to the suite door. So it's quite small, and that's consistent with the existing single egress requirements for a sprinklered building. And then the other thing is a 6-meter travel distance from the suite door to the exit within the public corridor. And I think the one thing that's interesting, keep in mind that the dead end corridor limits still apply. So in this example here, if this was 6 meters to the exit door, that would be fine. But if you put the exit door over on this side, it wouldn't really work anymore because these doors over here would probably be over 6 meters. But the dead end distance there from the door to the end of the corridor is over 6 meters. So then it kind of doesn't work on 2 fronts. Furthermore, if you put this door over here, for example, if you had like a corridor in the suite, you might be under the 6 meters to the exit, but if you were over 6 meters to the end of the corridor, you wouldn't be meeting the dead end corridor requirements. So there's sort of 2 things to consider there. There's the travel distance from the suite doors, and then also the dead end corridor requirements. Continuing on with the kind of what do these look like. So the exit stair discharge requirement. So this is kind of relates back to these point access building style buildings. So it does require a distance between the exit discharge to the street, and that's shown over here. It's similar to the principal entrance requirements for Part 3 buildings, which is 3 to 15 meters from the street to the exit discharge, so the point at which you leave the building. This is measured as a horizontal distance. It's not really measured along the path of travel. So if your path goes out here and then along, you don't have to measure it like out and across. You can just measure it horizontally from the street to the door. And well, okay. So that effectively limits you to kind of how you can configure your floor, because you do need to have this stair relatively close to the street. So it's definitely something to consider early on in your design. You don't want to have to, totally rearrange your units later on once you realize this. The other thing is that you're not allowed to have an exit through the lobby. So you can't you can't push this stair to go out through a lobby and consider the discharge to be a lobby door at the front. That's not allowed. You have to go straight out from your stair to the exterior. You could add a corridor in there as long as the corridor went out right outside, but you can't go through a lobby. You can go from the lobby into the stair and then out. You're just not allowed to lead people from the stair back through the building as part of their exit path. So, a couple notes I have here. The main reason for this is they want it to be close to the principal entrance. They don't want it to be used for things like package drop off, though. So while it has to be close to the principal entrance, you should have a lobby principal entrance still. I mean, I expect in all cases you would because you'll want to have elevator access. So you'll likely have a primary entrance plus this stair. And then there's a few reasons for that, but mainly it's to make sure the fire department has easy access to it, make sure people can get to the street easily, and it also reduces the potential that the access point will be in an isolated location, which reduces or increases security concerns and potentially increases the chance that it'll get blocked for some reason if somebody blocks off the exit route unknowingly. The other thing that was raised in a project I was working on or internally when we were reviewing this stuff is the fire department access should be simple. And I don't think the code requirements really consider through lot conditions. So, for example, if you had a street on both sides, and sometimes you can have that, but not really have access on the site between the two if it's a very narrow building or a very narrow lot. So if the principal entrance is on this side, and that's where the fire department's going to pull up to go into the lobby to look at the enunciator, they should have access to the stair from that side as well. You don't want to put your stair on like the opposite street. And so they pull up here that in order to actually reach the stair, they'd have to go like around the block. You don't want something like that. So although it's not really in the code, I think there's some good design strategies to consider to make sure that you're not delaying the fire department response. So lastly, I have a couple slides here on sort of specific design requirements as you get into more detailed design. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think most of the important sort of critical things are noted in here. Firstly, that you have to use an NFPA 13 sprinkler system and fire alarm. So even if it's a 3-story building, 4-story building, for example, where normally you could use NFPA 13R as the sprinkler standard, it has to be bumped up to NFPA 13, which it has additional water demand and more protection for concealed spaces, things like that. So it does offer a higher level of sprinkler protection, which is why they added that requirement. Next is some considerations for limits to smoke movement. And this is only if you're a 5 or 6-story building. So I think I mentioned before, you can do it for up to 6 stories, but if you're over 4 stories, then there's some additional requirements relating to Article 3262, and that's specifically for high buildings, but this sort of pulls that into any building of 5 or 6 stories with a single exit stair, regardless of the actual height in meters. In most cases, I think that life safety fans can be avoided for residential buildings, unless you have a basement story. And in that case, you do need pressurization for the basement floors, at least for the stairs, potentially for the floor as well for exhaust, though I don't completely recall on that one. So in most cases, if you it's a bit easier if you don't have like a basement storage garage or basement units or anything like that. It does offer a few exceptions to avoid this if you have vestibules, um, to avoid pressurization. So that there's a few options in there. They get a little bit complicated, but it's something to be aware of at least. Because I think in most cases it'll be incentivized to avoid any life safety fans because you will require a 2 hour emergency generator if you do have one. And because these buildings are so small, that's, a big expense, cost wise, but also just space wise. Trying to find space for that can be challenging. Suite entry doors have a requirement for bumping it up to 45 minutes. Normally, you can use a 20-minute door in a suite door into a public corridor, and also hold open devices. They're required on suite doors, but I think any door into the public corridor as well. Mainly, that's just to limit the chance that somebody's wedging the door open and increasing the chance that it'll actually close properly. So those are typically magnetic hold opens that will release on fire alarm. I've seen some on a project recently that aren't the typical like wall mounted magnets with the two plates. I've seen some that have some sort of electromagnet inside the closer itself. So you can just kind of move the door to any position you want during normal operation and it'll just stay there. But if the fire alarm goes off, then it releases that and it just releases like a normal closure. So there's some options are out there, I think, that are a little more pleasing aesthetically than the sort of traditional magnet that you would see for doors in a public corridor, for example. All right, lastly, this is the last sort of slide I have on the requirements. The exit construction, so this all relates to exit construction. This first thing here is it's a bit confusing in the code. It mentions you need non-combustible construction for the exit stair. So that would be normally steel stud or concrete fire separations. I mean, I think in pretty much every case, if you're building out of wood, you're probably not going to want to do that for the stair. So it does give you an option of, instead of doing that, finishes complying with table 3.1.13.7. And that's really just additional considerations for flame spread rating and smoke developed classification limits. In most cases, you're going to have drywall finishes for the ceiling and the walls, so that shouldn't be a problem as long as it's typical paper-faced drywall. It will add in a requirement though for floor finishes to be considered. So you will want to look at the flame spread rating and smoke developed classification requirements of the table for the floor finish. 2 hour fire resistance rating. That's typically achieved by 2 layers of 5/8 type X on each side. In a lot of cases, you do need 2 layers on at least one side to achieve the sound ratings. So I don't see this as being a huge difference in most cases. Maybe an extra layer on one of the sides to meet this. And you will need to use a listed or tested assembly. You can't use Appendix D in the code because it only allows up to 90 minutes for framed wall assemblies. And because these are Part 3 buildings, you also can't use the Part 9 tables. Lastly, the limit probability of storage through design and signage at landings. This is all about proactive deterrence of storage or misuse of the exit. And mainly this means removing excess landing areas and alcoves or enclosing void space under the stairs, basically not having any extra space that's not required that is likely to promote people to, shove extra equipment or whatever in there. I know in my last strata I was in, we had a snowblower stored under the stair for a while, which is definitely not allowed. So these things happen. So it's good to proactively design that out. And I think that's something that should be considered really in all buildings. It's not, although it's limited to this in the code, um, it's definitely something to consider. I realize I did miss one extra thing here. Exit width. These buildings need to have 1,500 milliliter wide exits. So that includes stairs and corridors if you have a corridor as part of your exit. So that's fairly critical also at the schematic stage where you're blocking everything out. So you definitely don't want to miss that like I almost did. Yeah, so that's it. I think we're running out of time here. So key takeaways, these are unique buildings. It doesn't change anything of the existing requirements, but these are not just regular buildings with one stair removed. Age shape pushback, there's some unknown barriers there. Where can you build these? I think major urban centers primarily. We talked about what these buildings look like, and also additional considerations, construction requirements to limit spread of fire and smoke. I think that's it. Thanks for listening. I know that was a bit of a gauntlet, but hopefully it was helpful.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a fantastic introduction. Got a few questions here. Firstly, from Michael, and this is more related to the city of Vancouver. Obviously, the presentation is about the BCBC. But Michael asks, I've heard the city of Vancouver has put on hold the exit stair condition, single exit stair condition, until the fire department can get the equipment to meet the requirements. Do you know anything about where the city of Vancouver and their code is at relating to this?
Not specifically. I've heard that, yeah, there's no plan to implement it immediately. That's about all I know. So I wouldn't hold your breath, I guess. Brian, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, my discussions with the policy engineers in Vancouver have been that the fire department is very reluctant and they're not really planning on implementing this anytime soon, but obviously there's political pressure. So it might be the case that the fire department is saying they want some additional equipment. That very well could be. But at the moment, it's not happening in Vancouver as far as we're aware.
Great. Thanks for that. Listen, I think you've already responded to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Will these requirements also apply to Part 9 townhouses, which are traditionally permitted to have one exit?
No, so that's just a different type of building. And because it's already allowed, like none of the existing requirements in the code have changed. It's just like a new building typology they've added a new subsection with things in there for this type of building. So any of the existing requirements haven't changed, and that includes townhouses.
Great. And the last one, Dominique asks about what additional features would be required in a non-sprinklered building to provide an appropriate water supply. So I think you mentioned additional features for water and sprinkling.
Yeah, well, I guess you're not, so if you have a single exit stair building under these requirements, it has to be sprinklered. So you will need to sprinkler it. You won't be able to have an unsprinkled building. It's just that you still need to consider the water supply available for manual firefighting operations in addition to the sprinkler requirements. I don't know too much about that, Brian. I don't know if you can speak to that a bit better, but I mean, there's some standards in the code about that. It needs to be considered. I think in most urban environments, it's likely already provided by the municipal water supply, so it may not be a huge additional consideration, but depending on the location, if it's in a new subdivision, for example, it might be an issue.
Yeah, I think mostly in the urban centers, it'll be covered already by the existing water supply network. If we get into the outlying areas, then perhaps we you would have to look at, say, the fire underrated survey, or if you're getting really into a rural area, though you might have a fire department response problem in that case. Then we can start looking at some of the NFPA allowances in 1142 and whatnot for on-site water and things like that. It is very complicated, but I don't think that would likely occur because of the firefighting challenges and indications that they want for these buildings.
Right, we got some really good questions coming in here. So firstly, Bruce asked, can the exit stair be an exterior stair?
Yeah, I think so. There's no restriction on that. I think if it's an interior stair, there's requirements around fire separations, and I suppose those would apply to the exterior stair to a certain degree. But I don't see any issues with that. You'll have to follow all the usual exit exposure requirements. You'll still need a standpipe if you're over a certain height, but otherwise, I think that would be fine.
Right, and relating to the exit stairs is kind of pushing the boundary a little bit here, but the question is about the potential for two buildings of this type to share a single exterior exit stair. So if you had two buildings on the same site, could they theoretically share one exit stair? It's quite
I think
interesting.
if they're sharing an exit stair, they would be considered as one building. At least that's sort of my opinion, because I don't see how you could really consider that as two buildings, because you wouldn't really have a horizontal exit between them. You'd kind of maybe there's some obscure configuration where it might make sense, but I think in general, if they're sharing a stair, they're likely considered a single building. So you would have to meet all these restrictions in terms of number of dwelling units per floor, for both buildings simultaneously. But I think if you're doing something like that, you're getting into the sort of, yeah, definitely more complex and specific configuration that would need more review.
Yeah, maybe he's thinking kind of two multiplexes that share a central staircase. I'm not sure. It's interesting.
Yeah, definitely interesting.
There you go. This is a good question from Brian, and we've had this one come up a couple of times recently. Does a balcony need to be added or need to be within that 25-meter travel distance?
Yeah, I was actually wondering that as well. I think the way it's worded in the code, no, because I believe it states from anywhere in the floor area, and the balcony is technically not part of the floor area. Now, in practice, I think it makes sense to try and meet that because you're having to go through if you're on your balcony, you have to go through the building to get to your stair. It's not really that reasonable to just have a large balcony and extend that distance by a huge amount. But it's not very clear, I would say.
Okay, I think it's probably time to move on. Sorry, I know there's a couple more questions coming here now, but I think we should move on to the second part of the presentation. So we're running a little late here. So thank you very much, Marc. Really appreciate your work there. Please let me introduce Corie Lubben, who's been practicing building code consulting with Celerity Engineering since 2016. She's registered as a RHFAC professional. Thank you very much, Corie.
All right, thanks, Nick. So as Nick said, I'm just going to go over some of the updates to these adaptable dwelling unit requirements. The way they've started off in the code has been maybe not quite as smooth or as organized as expected. So I think we'll just start going through them. So the idea today is to go over the effective dates and discuss that in-stream project protection that's out there. There's quite a lot of technical bulletins that have been issued since probably the spring and a lot of interpretations. So we'll glance through a couple of those as well and just go over them. As Nick said, one of them is the bedroom, but the bathroom is kind of a big area as well that we see a lot of good interpretations and information out there that we can use in our design moving forward. So as we know, back in March of this year, 2024, the 2020 24 edition of the BCBC came out, there was the exemption, and that is applicable to the adaptable dwelling units as well as the earthquake requirements that we are still able to use, and we are using the 2018 requirements, and that holds up until March 10th, 2025. So any project, as long as it's submitted for a building permit before that 2025, then we are using the 2018 for the adaptable units only. So the idea was come March 10th, 2025, we would have the 2024 building code in its entirety come into effect. But as of September, we've just received some more information, kind of another exception and allowance for these in-stream project protection. And so that gives these projects, again, the allowance to fall back within the 2018 code requirements specific to the adaptable or seismic requirements. And so the big question is, what is considered in-stream projects? So there's information, there's a good information bulletin board out there. And specifically, we have this applies to buildings that have applied for a development permit, and this is all before the March 2024 deadline, a rezoning application, or this last one is the third option, which is the big gray area and causing a lot of kind of ambiguity, and it just says has drawings that have been prepared for a building, and this is before the March 2024 deadline. So the information provided what that means. So these drawings either have information on the number of dwelling units in the residential occupancy, they show some sort of dimension of these dwelling units in the residential occupancy, and so looking for like specifics and things that impact or make a redesign, like a change of the plans. So the drawings also have to be prepared by or under the supervision of a registered professional. So as we know, that includes an architect with AIBC, an engineer, professional engineer, or professional licensee engineer with EGBC, as well as a registrant of the applied science technologists and technicians under the Professional Governance Act. And so that seems simple, but so what this really means is if we are applying one of these three options, the criteria is as of March 2027, which is a long time out, but you need to have those in-stream projects in for building permit application. And so the purpose behind all this, as has been raised and out there, it's just really to address all the concerns that have been raised by industry, not only costs, but things that have impact projects with redesign or redevelopment applications, just really feasibility of these projects and moving forward with the changes required to meet the new 2024 requirements when substantial effort has been made ahead of time. So, as I said, there is an information bulletin, and I urge you all to read it. It's got lots of good information. I just highlighted 3 of the questions that seem quite informative. So one is, do the drawings need to demonstrate the floor space changes or impacts as a result of the 2024 edition? And so the answer is clear, it's no. As long as your project meets one of those 3 criteria, so the development permit application, the rezoning, or the drawings. And again, that drawing is a very unclear one. And our recommendation is really to reach out to the AHJ that you're working with, because it is interpreted kind of gray. There's some opinions out there that means that these drawings are only submitted because there was no development permit or there was no rezoning application. And so maybe the municipality, they don't have those features required, so you're looking more rural, but there is no consensus and no solid information. We're hoping that something else gets published, but right now as a standpoint, you're best to just reach out to the HJ, see where they stand on it, and go forward from there. The next question was, do the drawings discussed for in-stream project exemption have to be the same as the building permit submission drawings? And again, clear answer, no. As we said, because those 3 options, one is development permit, these are typically generated early in your project, so they are not the same. But again, they do have to fall under one of those categories, so they have to show that commitment in terms of dwelling units and the sufficient detail to meet one of those 3 options. So there's clarification around that this person who's prepared the development or any of the drawings for that in-stream project protection, they do not have to be the same person who prepares the building permit drawings. So that's nice to know. And then the last question in these that I found pretty useful and just clarifies things is there any other requirement associated with in-stream project protection? And that just reiterates again that although you fall under this, you do have to apply for your building permit by 2027. And again, they're sticking with the March 8th. So moving forward, just these are applicable only to the adaptable dwelling units requirements, and that's section 385. So specifically, we're looking at the single-story dwelling units served by that interior corridor and accessible common entrance, as well as common spaces. So that is just to clarify. So we're limited within the dwelling unit. So we're looking at like the suite entry doors, hallways, all the rooms itself, everything inside. And that's where that exemption to apply the 2018 requirements apply. Within 385, there are requirements that reference outside of the dwelling units, and those are still required to comply with the 2024. So that is good to keep in mind. So as I said, lots of interpretations are going on. This is one that's very general. Someone was inquiring about doing a conversion inside the adaptable dwelling unit, whether they need to comply with the accessibility requirements. And again, clear answer on this is no. The intent of the adaptable dwelling units is really just to allow the user to make modifications, and those can be different for every user of that space. So there's no requirement to meet the 382 or 383 requirements. It is just for a user only. And so just a quick highlight that we are focusing on having people stay in their place, whether it's injury, aging, or illness. So we just want that space to be easily modified. And so as we go through all these changes or the adaptability features, you see really the focus is on clear space, because that's just something we can't achieve without a major renovation. So there's clear space throughout all the rooms, and then locations of switches is the focus. One of the new articles within the adaptable dwelling units is the bedroom. And so within it, there's 3 basic criteria. One is for a turning space, could be adjacent to the bed, essentially a transfer zone. You need a clear space in front of the closet, the door, and then an 850 pathway. This is where there was lots of room for clarification based on how they presented this. And so luckily there's lots of interpretations as well as information out in the bulletin. But one of the interpretations published was very clear that we do not need to show that double bed. That is not mandatory. And the 850 millimeter pathway, it only requires access on one side of the building, right to that transfer zone. The path is required throughout the suite to any kind of like controls that are used often, switches or operable windows. But it clarifies that if you want, for demonstration purposes, to show that you're meeting these adaptable requirements within the bedroom, you can have a single bed. It can be up against the wall, as long as there's nothing on that wall or you're blocking space that needs access. So that's definitely clarification. It does also allude to the fact that we have these demonstration of compliance. So noting that we are showing it's available, but it's not necessarily going to be the way it is constructed originally or requiring the furniture. So the information bulletin has some more clarification why at the beginning there was a lot of leniency, like, do we need that double bed? And again, they just clarified it for everyone, stating that that 2 persons per room is actually is more of a fire safety requirement. And so obviously we don't mandate furniture or anything within the building code, nor do we require 2 people to be within the room. So there is that flexibility now on the choice of bed. And again, it does clarify in these bulletins that there is like a demonstration drawing, that it doesn't have to be the bed the occupants select moving forward. So the bathroom is another area. I find there's loads and loads of information out there. So I urge you all to look through the new bulletins and information that's out. I'm going to touch through a little bit. I know we are tight for time today, but essentially the bathroom requirements, we have the lateral space between the bed. We have the location of the toilet and the wall. We talk about plumbing fixtures and accommodating the future installation of sinks and showers or bathtubs. And so the clear space needed around it. And then we have the future for the reinforcement of the wall to accommodate the grab bars. So one of the great interpretations I think out there is about the toilet. So that water closet is fixed. You need that in your initial design. that just acknowledges that any kind of moving around of your toilet is really a major renovation. So that's the things we're trying to avoid within the adaptable units. So you do have that fixed against the wall, but the water closet is a initial design type thing. Within this interpretation, they do clarify about a zero threshold shower, which is quite interesting. So because your toilet is in your initial design, if you have a zero threshold shower in your initial design too, then you are allowed to use that clear space as overlap for your transfer space in the toilet. So there is encouragement to use the clear spaces that are required, just to like use them for multi-purposes. You don't need to isolate two beside. We are allowed the overlap. So with the zero threshold shower, again, that transfer space is allowed to overlap into the shower, which is quite nice. Just some more interpretations, clarity around the plumbing systems and what that specifically means, and the installation of the future. So either your shower or your bathtub, and whether it needs to incorporate that 1700 millimeter diameter or clear space. And again, no, it's just the plumbing systems we're looking for, but it does need to account for that clear space in the future design. So there is a number of these interpretations out there. This is the last one I really want to touch on, and it talks about having a future wall hung sink and whether it can encroach into that clear space of your transfer zone in the, I guess, relating to the water closet or the toilet. And so the answer is yes. Within the notes, we also talk about it being permitted to encroach in the clear space of the shower as long as it's by the fold down bench. So again, as long as the wall hung sink is opposite the water closet, you can have that encroach in the space. And again, it's going to be that 430 millimeter encroachment permitted with the knee space and the clearance underneath the sink. So those are the highlights of the interpretation. There is quite a few more out there. I will leave them in our slides that we'll probably distribute to everyone. But today, with our tight base for time, I'll just touch on the balconies. They do not need to be accessible. That's another one that always comes up through our office. So they are in an adaptable unit. They are not accessible. So, and then in closing, I'll just highlight, the code is the minimum, but you're welcome to go beyond always and just feel free to practice good design. And that's it, Nick.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Corie. We do have a couple of questions here, but just before that, just wanted to just re-emphasize the importance of reaching out to the local municipality regarding whether or not your projects are or are not exempt from these new rules. There is a really ambiguous paragraph written in that bulletin, which has confused a lot of municipalities, and a lot of them have different interpretations as a result. Some are saying, oh, actually, we require some form of application to have been applied for. So again, we just want to, until we get that cleared up and get the BSSB to provide some clarity on that, we do strongly recommend you reach out to that municipality and just confirm whether your project is in stream or not. Yeah, I think we got time for a couple of questions, Corie, if that's all right.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask just one myself actually regarding the shower and having being able to use that shower for clearance. I just want to confirm: does that shower have to be installed at the time of construction, or is that you can have a bath in there and still use a future shower, the clearance within a future shower?
No, you're right. The zero threshold shower would have to be part of the initial design, because the toilet, as well as the initial design, and that clear space has to be accounted for. So the shower and the bathtub, that clear space can be shown future, but because the toilet is the fixed, you need to have that lateral space beside it as part of the initial design. So that would require the zero threshold shower in the initial.
Fantastic, thank you. And Ali asks, can millwork or plumbing intrude on the required adaptable clearances? Could we have a double sink that intrudes on the clearance that can then be converted into an accessible sink in the future?
Yes, that's right. Because the sinks are future install, so it's just where you locate your plumbing, but the sink itself or whatever you want in there can be, and your initial one install can be much different than the one that's moving forward. So there is also, with that lateral transfer space beside the toilet, it doesn't say, it does offer in one of the information bulletins, like you can put some furniture in there. Obviously, if it's when you using the space, you're not needing it as a user, so you can put shelves or do other things with that space, but it does need to be available in the initial design.
Fantastic. I think maybe this is the last question here, but I think you might have just answered this one. The question is, why does your diagram measure the transfer space requirement for the toilet from the lateral extent of the bowl and does not include that of the tank? I guess they're talking about the cistern. Can the width of the tank be excluded?
Ooh, that's a good question. The drawing is just my lack of drawing capabilities. It's not the forte of our code consultant to do drawings. So I will apologize for that, but the space is just the clear space. So wherever the edge of the toilet, you would measure that from.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Corie, and to Celerity. As we said, we've just posted, I think Helen's just posted the link to get your AIBC learning credits. This obviously we have to go through a process to get these courses and seminars approved by the AIBC, and we haven't done that with any other organization. So unfortunately, it's just the AIBC to answer someone's question. And again, yeah, we will email you the link to a recording of this seminar and indeed the other two as well, and give you updates on future seminars that we'll be holding. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone for attending, and have a fantastic Christmas.